So right now I'm going to walk you guys through the turn structure, phase structure, round structure of Infamy. So 2 rounds comprise a turn, and each round has 3 phases in it. There's a day round and a night round, and I'll explain a little bit more about that later. So the very first thing that we're going to do is contacts are going to be dealt out across the top of the board. The trigger man, who is the first player, is going to move the Terran Watchdogs. So the Terran Watchdogs are going to block out a sector in the sector phase. They're going to block them out in the sector phase. So this is called the contact phase. So after the trigger man moves the Watchdogs, the next thing that's going to happen is players are going to bid on each of these contacts here sequentially. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What's going to happen is they're going to bid, and then they're going to resolve the effect of that. How players bid is, the mechanic is called the pay-to-play mechanic, where you have to spend a bribe just to bid. Your currency in the game is called bribes. Everyone has 12. That is a fixed amount. You will only have 12 to work with throughout the entire game. So here we can see we're placing bribes on the first contact. If this went all the way around, and let's say another player raised it, this player would have to actually pay expenses again, and then exceed that bid by 1. So you really have to call your shots pretty wisely here, otherwise you're going to end up wasting money. As we go through and we resolve each of these, after we do that, then we're going to move on to the next phase of the game, which is called the sector phase. In the sector phase, each player has 6 sector cards in their hand, and these actually correlate to the spaces on the board. So what's going to happen is each player is going to choose one of these cards, put it face down. They're going to put their pawn on it to indicate that that's what they've chosen. They put their other cards aside, face down, so that other players don't know what they've chosen. And they're going to flip them over simultaneously. And then, dependent upon who won what contact across the top of the board, that player will then choose to go into that sector, choosing one of the 3 available actions. There's only 2 types of actions you can resolve when you go into a sector. The first and most basic one would be the resupply action. By placing your pawn in one of the 2 square resupply spaces, you get the corresponding effect. Moreover, these effects are going to be to do things like gain compound, resources. You can gain henchmen. There is a special space on the board where if it's the daytime, you get this effect. If it's the nighttime, you get that effect. And then you have these areas here, which are called headquarters. The first time you go to the headquarters, you get a rep in the faction. So for example, if I went here, I would get 1 rep in the cartel. And then every time I would go here to this space after the fact, now that I have rep, I've been initiated into the faction, I would then have access to this deck of cards that relates to that faction, specific to that faction. And these are called scheme cards, and we'll talk about that in the 3rd phase, the scheme phase. So the other spot on the board is the mission space. Across the bottom of the board, there will be a number of missions equal to the number of players in the game. As you can see here, if somebody was to place in this mission spot for 2, if they had the corresponding resources, they would be able to complete either of these missions. If they don't have the corresponding resources, they would then defer down to one of these 2 spaces. If more than, in this example, let's say no one had the resources to complete the mission and all 3 players decided to go here, only 2 of them would actually get to complete these actions. The 3rd would actually fail based upon this contact order here. So let's say pink was first, then brown, and blue chose sector 2 as well, they would get nothing. So trying to figure out where people are going to go, what they're after, what their plans are, trying to anticipate that is a big part of this portion of the game. In terms of how missions work, missions are pretty simple. They're going to have a sector where you have to go. They're going to have the resources that are required to complete the mission. You will then resolve the reward for completing the mission. You will gain reputation for that faction, and you will also gain infamy. The two ways that you win the game is you either get all the way, you go all the way up in one of the factions and you take over the faction by making it to a level 5, or you gain 15 or more infamy points, representing that you have started your own faction, your own empire here in the Martian colony. So, as you can see here, we have 2 missions that relate to this one sector. Only one of these missions could be completed. If 2 players had the different resources here, whichever player would be higher would be the person who had the first crack at that. So not only in the first phase is bidding on these important for what they give you, but also the order is extremely important. After players complete the sector phase, the last phase of the round is going to be called the scheme phase. During the scheme phase, the very first thing that happens is if a player has 1 or more schemes in their hand, they can then play one of those schemes. As you can see here, this scheme says that you would recover 4. And what that means is you could take 4 of your bribes that are spent and flip them back over for use in the next round, which I will explain. This would only be very useful in a day phase. There would be no sense in playing this card at night. So the 3 factions have separate decks. There are strategies and mechanics that are specific to each faction within these decks. Not everyone will have a scheme. Not everyone will play a scheme. After everyone has had the opportunity to play their schemes, the next thing that we're going to do is, dependent upon whether it's day or night, we're going to do the following. If it's day, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to retrieve all of our bids that we left on these contacts. Everyone will leave 1 bribe on there to represent that they won that contact. That will then move down here. That's called retrieving your bribes. After that, players are then going to flip over this and the round marker, and then we're going to go to the next round. I forgot to mention this, but whoever wins the last contact, every time someone wins a contact, they end up with the trigger man marker. So the person who ends up winning the last contact available will be the trigger man for the next round, giving them the ability to move this marker. So that's also a unique feature. Sometimes if you want to plan ahead, being last is actually a good thing. So if it's the night phase, now a couple of other things that happen that don't normally happen. For every 2 henchmen players have, they would gain 1 infamy point. These are basically, the idea here is these are goons that work for you. You can actually clone yourself in the game and have an army of just bootleg copies of yourself. So who better to trust than a clone of yourself, right? So
I don't know, I know me pretty well.
All right, so players will gain 1 infamy point for every 2 that they have. If it's the night phase, you actually take all of your bribes that are spent, including the retrieve bribes off of the contacts. You flip those back over. You will flip this to the day marker, and you're going to shuffle back in all of the contacts that were used, okay? And then we're going to go to another day round. During the scheme phase, this is also the opportunity where we check to see if somebody has met one of the victory conditions. The victory conditions being 15 or more infamy points, or a player has gained 5 or more rep in a single faction. If this is a day round, and you flip it over to night, what you're going to do is you're going to actually deal out 5 more of the 8 remaining contacts, and you will bid with whatever bribes you have left. So that's an interesting part of the economic dynamic in the game, is that you have to really stretch that budget out across 2 rounds. So as I stated, there is a day and a night round where the only difference is in the scheme phase and the fact that you don't get your bribes back and the situation with the henchmen. You basically just rinse, repeat this process until someone has achieved one of those 2 conditions, and then they are the more infamous player. Touchdown.